One thing that I kept thinking as I'm reading this work and reading Kanafani's other work, like Men in the Sun and all these great works of Palestinian resistance, is that he was killed. He was killed at the age of 31 by the Israeli Mossad, by the Israeli occupation, by Israeli intelligence, by imperialism. And it's like, how many more pivotal works would he have published if he wasn't killed at that young age? Right? Not just works like this on Zionist literature, which was a work he was commissioned to do by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, his political party. They said analyze Zionist literature and Zionist novels and understand why the Zionists are so good at narrative control and propaganda and how they've tricked so many people into supporting their occupation, ethnic cleansing, and expulsion of Palestinian Arabs. Right, so he does this systematic analysis, and it's absolutely brilliant and incredibly useful politically for Palestinians in the struggle. Right, but not only that, but he was a novelist. Right, he would write historical fiction, or he would write books about the Palestinian experience that were like narratives, like storybooks almost, about that would help people understand the life of Palestinians who had been expelled from their villages and from their homeland by Israel, because he himself was expelled by the Zionist forces when he was a child from his homeland in Palestine. So he understood that experience better than anyone else. And he had the education and the intellect and the capacity to write about it and put it into words and put it into narrative form in a beautiful way. So what does Israel do? They kill him. They massacre, or I guess a massacre is when they kill a lot of people, but they've massacred the Palestinian intelligentsia, Palestinian academics, right? Anybody who has this great intellect and an ability to write things that motivate people to struggle for Palestine, that bring Palestinians together, give Palestinians a shared sense of culture, right? Those are the people who Israel specifically targets for assassination, right? And that's why we describe this as an ethnic cleansing, right? Because that's what it is. It's trying to remove these people from their land, trying to mow the grass and keep the population low. But also, it's the destruction of Palestinian culture and heritage and history. And you hear Zionists like Dr. Eli David on Twitter, a disgusting, idiotic Zionist who I don't know why he calls himself a doctor. I don't know what he's a doctor of. He doesn't do anything except sit on Twitter all day and tweet about Israel. So clearly he's not a very busy doctor. But either way, one of the things he loves to say is, what have Palestinians ever produced? What have Palestinians ever created? Palestinians have created some of the greatest literature of all time, douchebag. Some of the greatest literature of all time. That's why you guys killed them. That's why you guys killed them. So you could sit on Twitter and say, oh, the Palestinians never produce anything. They don't produce any great art and literature. Yeah, they do. Kanafani did. That's why you killed him and his niece in a car bomb, you idiot. And earlier this year, the great Palestinian poet and writer, Rafid Al-Arir, was killed by Israel. And he got a letter from the Israeli Mossad before he was killed saying, we are going to kill you. Right? So he left his family and friends because he's a hero and he didn't want to bring anyone down with him. But then Israel killed him. Because why would we let the Palestinians have art? Why would we let the Palestinians have culture? Right? We have to exterminate that because the Israeli government is a fascist ethno-nationalist government that is trying to ethnically cleanse Palestinian Arabs. So here's a TikTok video I did about this subject.
Racist Zionists love to say the Palestinians have never produced anything. What have they ever created? When the Zionists have been systematically murdering all of the great minds and thinkers out of Palestine for the last 70 years. I just finished a book from the legendary Palestinian author and journalist Ghassan Kanafani, and I have another one on its way in the mail. Okay, this man was a genius. He was a beautiful fiction writer and a brilliant academic, and Israel killed him, along with his niece, in a car bomb because he didn't support Israel, because Israel expelled him from his home when he was just a child, just like they expelled 75% of the Palestinian population at the time. And if you think that they've stopped doing stuff like this, you would be wrong. In fact, earlier this year, an Israeli missile targeted and killed the Palestinian poet Rifat Al-Arir. And you see, Israel loves killing the Palestinian artists, the Palestinian intelligentsia, because these people are able to mobilize resistance with their art, and they give the Palestinians a shared sense of culture. And that's what the Israelis want to destroy. because this is truly a project of ethnic cleansing. They don't want the Palestinians to produce art and culture, so they systematically take out the Palestinian artists. It's one of the sickest things imaginable. They're just trying to destroy an entire culture of people so they can take their land. It's sick.
Right. Massacring the intelligentsia, and as Uno and Julie have already pointed out in the chat, the Israelis will also take Palestinian cultural productions and claim them as their own and say these are Israeli. So they appropriate Palestinian culture, they kill Palestinian artists, and then they sit on Twitter and say we should be allowed to genocide these people. They don't produce anything. Yes, they do. You just either steal it or kill the people producing things. So it's the most sick and twisted thing, and the Israelis have really mastered propaganda. I mean, truly, Joseph Goebbels, the famous Nazi propagandist, would be very jealous of what the Israelis have been able to do in convincing people to support their apartheid and their systematic ethnic cleansing of Palestinian Arabs. And oops, almost knocked my mug over. But that's why I'm going to do a full breakdown of this book, because it is truly incredible. It looks at the roots of not just the Zionist movement, but Zionist propaganda and Zionist literature, which existed far, far, far before the state of Israel existed. And Kanafani traces this Jewish literature, this ancient religious Jewish literature, and shows how the Israelis have taken it and manipulated it, mined it for quotes, or transformed it into Zionist literature. So they take these Jewish religious stories and Jewish religious character archetypes, like the archetype of the wandering Jew, which had been a character in Jewish literature for a long time, and it was a religious character, and they transformed that into a Zionist character. So the wandering Jew in Zionist literature is no longer wandering once he settles in Israel, once he joins the IDF. Right. So for years, there had been this religious character archetype of the Jew who deals with oppression and wanders the earth and questions God and challenges God, but ultimately, reconciles with God and accepts his faith. That was the wandering Jew character. When the Zionists take over the literature, now you have this wandering Jew character who's no longer wandering once he settles in Israel, once he goes home. Right. And this had never been part of Jewish religious literature before. Right. This was something that the Zionists did with Jewish literature. This is a way they manipulated and mined Jewish literature for things that could help their political narrative. And it's, brilliant because Jewish kids grow up reading these stories and reading Zionist books like Exodus, right, which is supposed to be the history of the founding of the state of Israel. But even people in Israel recognize it's not a very good history. It's mostly just good for tricking Americans into supporting Israel. And coincidentally, it was turned into a movie a few years after it was published in 1960. But this book tries to tell the story of the founding of Israel, but basically, the Arabs are just hopelessly backwards and waiting to be expelled, whereas the Zionists are heroes. They're heroic in founding their homeland. And anytime the book Exodus has to talk about the expulsion of Palestinians from their homeland, the expulsion of the indigenous people, it just deflects to the Holocaust. It says, well, Jews were cleansed in the Holocaust, so they're not welcomed in Europe, and we should be able to have Palestine. You say, well, what about the Palestinians who are already there, who are being pushed off of their homes, who are being pushed out of their villages, pushed off their land? They say, well, the Holocaust. The Holocaust happened to Jews. We have to, right? So it's always two wrongs make a right, is the argument that the Zionist literature always falls back on. Maybe I'll get into this book now. Screw it. So they also, the Zionist literature also weaponizes Hebrew. So there's an explicit goal of the Zionists, who eventually become a well-oiled political machine with lots of big money behind them. They need to turn Hebrew into an actual language. Previously, Hebrew was just used for Jewish religious matters and was found in Jewish religious texts. But they needed to turn it into an actual language that could stand on its own, so that they could argue that Jews are not a religion, right, but a nation. Because before that, there was no real argument that the Jewish people constituted their own nation, that they had a shared sense of geography, economic life, and a shared language, which are the things that usually constitute a nation. So in order to make this argument, the Zionists had to elevate the religious language of Hebrew to a language of its own. And this is what they tried to do, was mine Jewish religious texts, Jewish religious literature, and transform it from religious literature into nationalistic literature. That's what the project of Zionism has always been about, especially Zionist literature. Political Zionism, Kanafani argues, is rooted in literary Zionism. Literary Zionism well preceded the establishment of political Zionism at the conference in Basel, Switzerland in 1987. So there were, Jewish literature was being transformed into Zionist literature, into nationalistic literature, well before political Zionism was officially established. So he also makes the argument that the Jewish people who were pushing nationalism, who were pushing Zionism, were the wealthy ones, the bourgeoisie, right? The socioeconomic elites. And there were a lot of Jewish people who were pushing for social integration, who were saying, no, we should integrate into European societies, right? We should integrate and join these societies and still keep our religious customs. But, there's nothing that says that we can't live in Europe, that we can't live peacefully here. And what the Zionists do is accept the same premise as the Nazis and say, no, social integration is impossible. Jewish people cannot integrate into Europe. And therefore, we need to go to Palestine and found our own state. Right? So Zionism accepts the exact same philosophical underpinnings of Nazism. The idea that Jewish people cannot integrate into Western societies, so they need to go found their own ethno-state and push Palestinians off the land. So we see here in Kanafani the importance of a class analysis. And this is why Kanafani is so valuable in his analysis of Zionism, because he was involved in the struggle. Right? He was expelled from his home by the Zionists, and he joined a Marxist-Leninist political party to struggle against it. So he has a perspective that's so valuable for Westerners as somebody involved in the struggle against apartheid and ethnic cleansing and capitalist imperialism. And he gives us a Marxist class analysis of the growth of Zionism and says that the socioeconomic elites pushed Zionism and nationalism in the Jewish communities and suppressed those who were pushing for social integration. Those who were saying, no, there's nothing, we don't have to accept the philosophy of the Nazis that says we're not allowed to live in Europe. Sorry, the argument that Zionists give is that Jews were driven out of Europe by the Holocaust, and that's true, and Jews were driven to Zionism by the Holocaust. In many ways, that's true, right? The Zionist argument that we need our own state, we need a safe place for Jews, was strengthened by the horrific oppression and ethnic cleansing of Jews that was going on in Europe, right? But at the same time, the ones who were really pushing nationalism and the ones who were really pushing Zionism pre-1948 were the socioeconomic elites of the Jewish community, right? It wasn't working class Jewish people. It was the Jewish elites, the people with the money and the power who could push this really shoddy scholarship, this really shoddy Zionist literature that manipulated Jewish literature and turned it into a political, nationalistic, imperialistic project, which is what Israel is. And again, it's an inversion of the Nazi ideology that was so popular at the time. And those who argued against Zionism within the Jewish community were horrifically suppressed with the money of the socioeconomic elites. So in the 1800s, racism was decreasing, and these ideas of equality were increasing. So what the Zionists responded to with these narratives of equality and the idea that different religious and ethnic groups can live together in the same state and in the same civilization was resisted by the Zionists, who responded with a narrative of Jewish supremacy, right? Saying, no, that Jews actually can't integrate into European society. They need their own homeland where they can basically have an ethno-state and flourish. It's so close to Nazi ideology, you guys. Once you actually look at the philosophical underpinnings of Zionism, you realize it is fascism. It's just an inverted form of fascism, right? The philosophical underpinnings are the same as Nazism. There are a lot of examples that push this idea of Jewish supremacy and push against social integration. like Disraeli's Wondrous Tales of Alroy. Disraeli ended up being a Zionist politician, or maybe even the Israeli prime minister. And he published this book pushing this Jewish supremacist ideology, which also started to transform the Jewish hero into a Zionist hero, right? So taking the literature from a focus on Jewish people living wherever in the world and the Jewish experience and transforming it into a Zionist experience, saying the Jewish hero is no longer a virtuous person who struggles against oppression and is an upstanding person in their community and serves God, right? That was the Jewish hero in Jewish literature for years. They transformed that into no. The Zionist hero is someone who, in response to oppression, goes to Israel, pushes the Palestinians off their land, and helps the state of Israel flourish. So over time in Jewish and Zionist literature, you see this transformation. And books like The Wondrous Tales of Alroy by Disraeli that push this Zionist hero narrative are the ones that get funding from the Zionist socioeconomic elites. There's also a book in 1876 by George Eliot called Daniel Deronda, which basically lays out a Zionist plan of action to settle in Palestine for the first time. So explicitly saying this is where we can found a state, and the hero of that book is someone who goes to that state and helps found the state of Israel. Daniel Deronda book is recognized as one of the first times that Jewish characters in a piece of literature discuss a Jewish state explicitly. So this book represented the ideas of this emerging Zionist current of thought, this current of thought in the Jewish community that was being pushed by socioeconomic elites, which at its core rejects integration and pushes an idea of Jewish supremacy. So this book was less overtly racist than other books. It dressed up the Jewish supremacy, the racism, in a humanist mask. But still ultimately rooted in this idea of Jewish supremacy. And what's important about the book Daniel Deronda is it laid out an action plan for the Zionist hero in Zionist literature for the first time. And if you want to know how much this literature was being pushed by wealthy, influential, powerful Zionists, there's a street in Tel Aviv today that's named for Eliot, the author of that book that laid out the Zionist plan of action for the first time. So Zionist literature continues to change Jews from a religious group into a national group with explicit political goals. So the other thing, Kanafani's a Marxist-Leninist, so he understands that literature isn't created in a vacuum, right? There are material conditions that produce literature. There are material conditions that form the author of this literature, right? So his analysis that it was the socioeconomic elites, it was the ruling class, the capitalists, the bourgeoisie who were pushing Zionism and nationalism. That's important. He's talking about the material factors that led to the production of this literature and the explicit political goals of this literature. And he talks about how the material conditions of society are often reflected in art and literature. Right? This is the idea of basin superstructure, as it's often called, a conceptual device for explaining how literature and artistic productions are rooted in material conditions and the type of society, the organization of society, how much wealth a person grows up with, how much privilege they grow up with. These all affect a person's experience and affect the kind of art that they'll produce. Even more so than that, the publishers at the time and the people who had the money to push certain kinds of literature were the socioeconomic elites, people with wealth. So at the time in the Jewish community, that was the Zionists, the nationalists, right? They had their own reasons and interests in founding a state in Palestine that they would be in charge of as the socioeconomic elites, right? So the literature at the time reflects the material conditions of the authors of that literature and the people who had the money to push that literature. So this stereotype emerges in Zionist literature. A stereotype hero emerges in Jewish literature of the Zionist hero, who's basically this infallible character, this character who's smarter and wittier and more driven and more disciplined than everybody else around them. And they have the explicit purpose in these stories of founding the state of Israel on top of Palestine. So this kind of literature, again, starts to lay out a plan of action for the Zionists. And this wandering Jew archetype begins to transform into a conqueror, a character who's no longer wandering around and struggling with God, right? The stories no longer focus on the Jewish character's relationship with God and their religion and their community. It now focuses on their mission to conquer Palestine, right? And this is a transformation that happens over hundreds of years. This wandering Jew archetype goes back hundreds and hundreds of years in Jewish religious literature. And the socioeconomic elites manipulatively took that wandering Jew character archetype and turned it into a Zionist conqueror character archetype, where all of a sudden this wandering Jew is no longer wandering once he gets to Israel. Right? So that's a transformation of a character archetype that happens over hundreds of years in Zionist literature and Jewish literature that Kanafani makes an astute analysis of. So here we see how the religious myths or religious stories or religious texts of the Jewish religion are manipulated by chauvinist, wealthy, nationalistic, fascistic Jews at the time to promote colonization and promote pushing Palestinians off their land. So let me read a passage on page 54 real quick. So this is the wandering Jew figure in a book called The Stranger. It says, this might be actually, let me just read it. Okay. Yes, I am a sinner. I have committed the greatest sin, for I was plowing my field when I should have been taking part in the struggle for the freedom of my people. Now God's terrible punishment is upon me. I shall have to wander all over the world, and long shall I seek the Messiah. Now I go to do what I must. I will search for the Messiah for a long, long time. I will do what I have to do. I will do what I have to do. So basically, this wandering Jew character archetype in the book The Stranger is saying that God is punishing him for not going to Israel and joining the struggle. Right? So you see the effect that this kind of literature being pushed by chauvinistic, nationalistic characters, you can see the effect that had on the Jewish community or on young people. Right? People are reading these stories that with the message and the moral of the story is that God will punish you if you're a Jewish person who doesn't support Israeli nationalism and Zionism. Right? So this is the kind of literature that indoctrinated tons of young people and tons of young Jewish people. And it shows why the Zionists have been so successful in narrative control. Commenting on this theater group, Rakin Ben Ari, a founder of Habima, writes, I still see Zemek, the actor who played the part of the farmer prophet, before me, lifting his bag and staff with a piercing sigh, climbing up to the top of the construction, where exclaimed in a mystic tone of voice, Ani halek el habas et el Messiah. I am going in search of the Messiah. These were not empty words for him. He was always looking for a Messiah himself, for the theater, for the people. He believed in the redemption of his people and hoped that the Habima would bring the problem of the Jew before his eyes of the world. And then moving on from that passage, Kanafani himself comments, this expert precisely summarizes the political instrumentalization of a religious matter. The political instrumentalization of a religious matter. That's a very important concept in this book. It was not a coincidence, as we will see, for politically chauvinistic Jews to have widely promoted this play along with the book Daniel Deronda, which also mixed religion and race under the banner of the national homeland, right? Transforming the Jewish religion into a Jewish nationality so they can make this nationalistic argument for the colonization of Palestine and establishment of Israel. Just within half a century, these three elements established the most grotesque case of settler colonial conquest in modern history, right? So they had to make this argument for Jews as a nation rather than a religion. And in doing so, they manipulated religious literature and turned it into nationalistic Zionist literature and brainwashed a bunch of people into colonizing Palestine and ethnically cleansing the Palestinians in the name of giving Jewish people a homeland where they can be safe. Which, nobody would argue against Jews having a place where they can be safe and being protected. But you can't have an ethno-state. You can't have an apartheid state where Palestinian Arabs who have been living there for thousands of years aren't welcome. Right? You have to have a civilization where all people can live equally right? Which is the idea of the Enlightenment, right? And the idea that liberal societies are supposed to be based on. Everybody's equal under the law. And Israel is the only apartheid state left on earth where they say, no, explicitly, you're not equal under the law. You're only given protections if you are a Jewish person. Moving on, that was a fantastic piece there from Kanafani. The end of the wandering Jews' suffering in Zionist literature as opposed to Jewish literature becomes the establishment of the state of Israel. And Theodor Herzl, who was a former Israeli leader and considered one of the founders of political Zionism, he also wrote a piece of literature called The Old New Land. And Kanafani says that this is a qualitative shift where Zionist literature becomes fully and explicitly political. So in Theodor Herzl's book, the whole focus of the book is founding the state of Israel, the colonization of Palestine. And there were organized efforts from the Zionists, which during Herzl's time had become a well-oiled political machine with tons of money behind it. There were tons of efforts to push his book and push his literature and suppress any other literature that argued for social integration of Jews into European society. So again, they pushed the same philosophical premise as the Nazis. So as the political goals of Zionism became increasingly explicit, so too does the falsification of history become increasingly necessary for Zionist authors. So the more they explicitly argue for the colonization of Palestine, the more they need to lie and distort the facts in order to trick people into supporting it. Because of course, they're supporting ethnic cleansing and the expulsion of an indigenous people in order to steal their land at the end of the day. Right? And they can justify that as much as they want, right? And say we need to do this or it's right to do this as much as they want. But the more that they say that, the more they're going to need to lie to justify this. And you see this in Zionist literature. The more explicitly political the literature becomes, the more focused Jewish stories become on founding the state of Israel and ethnically cleansing Palestinians and pushing them off the land, the more the authors of that literature have to lie in order to justify it. It makes perfect sense. And Kanafani says this is due to the contradiction at the core of Zionist ideology, which says it's justified to colonize another people because of the Holocaust or because in response to Jewish oppression, we're going to oppress another group of people. That's the contradiction at the core of Zionism. And in the writing of Zionist literature, that contradiction is expressed through the more explicitly political the literature is, the more that literature is filled with lies. So the book Exodus that I brought up at the beginning of this segment is a perfect example. It is a work of fiction that's taken by many, many Westerners to be the real story, the real history of the founding of Israel. And even Zionists and Israelis have said that book is crude, right? It's not a really good or well-detailed history or a good piece of scholarship. All it's good for, all that Exodus is good for, is convincing Westerners to support Israel. Right? And Exodus is also filled to the brim with lies. It's filled to the brim with falsifications, with distortions, right? Which is why even Israelis say it's not that good of a book. But Westerners don't know that. So let's give it to them and we can trick them into supporting Israel and thinking Israel is just and ignoring the colonization of Palestine. And anytime the book Exodus, which was turned into a movie to further brainwash Westerners in 1960, which is another example of how wealthy elites pushed Zionist art and artistic productions and Zionist literature and movies. What was I saying? That literature is pushed in the West, and Westerners don't know that it's not entirely historically accurate. So screw it. And anytime that book confronts the colonization and expulsion of Palestinian Arabs, all it does is deflect to the Holocaust. Right? It says, well, we should be allowed to do this because we were oppressed in the Holocaust, which is something that, of course, the Arab Palestinians had nothing to do with. So it makes zero sense. The book is riddled with lies, and Norman Finkelstein also shows that in his work, Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine Conflict. He gives a great debunk of Exodus, as I recently did on TikTok as well, and you can go check out that video if you want. But that's because Exodus is explicitly political. It's a whole book that focuses on the colonization of Palestine, and the heroes of that book are the colonizers. So because it tries to make these colonizers the heroes, it needs to use tons and tons of lies and distortions to justify their actions. So the more political the books get, the more they're chock full of lies. The more they have to falsify history. And they also, Kanafani argues that in order to portray Jewish people as a nation rather than a religion, and to portray them as a race, the more they have to give Jews superior characteristics to the Arabs, right? So they give them these superior characteristics and say these are racial characteristics. These are the racial characteristics of Jewish people that make them superior, and therefore they should be able to have their own nation on top of Palestine, rather than living in harmony with the Palestinian Arabs who had been there for years. They need to distinguish Jewish people from Arabs and even from Europeans. So in order to do this, the Zionist authors rely on this idea of Jewish supremacy. So again, it's an idea that a certain kind of people can't integrate into European society, and that some people are racially superior to others. Sound familiar? Do the philosophical or the core philosophical ideas of Zionism sound familiar? It's fascism. It's Nazism. Just inverted in an inverted form and directed against Palestinian Arabs rather than being directed against Jewish people themselves. So let me read to you a passage on page 65 of this book, which is an analysis, I believe, of the book Exodus that we were just discussing by Leon Uris. So this is on page 65 and 66. Bear with me here as I find it. Okay. There is a novel that cannot be described as anything, this is Kanafani, other than a crude distortion of history, namely Leon Uris's Exodus, which will be discussed at greater length later, and it's also discussed in Norman Finkelstein's Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Yet it is commonly regarded as a historical novel. Let us turn for now to a Zionist authority's discussion of this work, for whom the novel's inconsistencies and contradictions are deemed to be markers of its success and quality. So this is a Zionist talking about the book Exodus by Leon Uris. Okay? It seems to me that there has been, during the last years, only one English Jewish writer who has boldly made this confrontation, rethinking or confronting of the position of the Jew today. And that, surprisingly, is Leon Uris in Exodus. Soon after it had made its first impact in the United States, I asked one of the most representative Israelis what he thought of it. He replied that he forced himself to read it. It was a vulgar book, but a good book for the American Jews. So it's a book that's not very true, but it makes the argument, the case for Israel, really well to uninformed Americans who don't actually know what's going on. I have often thought about that answer and what it really meant. Did he mean that it was just good propaganda? I don't know now, but clearly Uris achieved something much more. He has written a book which has been more widely read by the present generations of American Jews, and probably also of English Jews, than the Bible, and which is better known to the younger generations than the Bible, and largely accepted by it as the authentic version of how the state of Israel came to be established. So he's explicitly saying this book is hogwash. It's a vulgar history or a distortion of history, but it's gotten a ton of Americans to read it and think that it's true. And the ones who think that is true support Israel. So awesome. Uris put sex, success, and James Bondism into Zionism. He gave the Jewish masses of all income groups the image they had been longing for. He showed them that the new Jew could follow the Gentile pattern and emulate it. He did more. He also confronted the non-Jewish reading public with this image of the new Jew. And outside England, they liked it. So this Zionist character, this new Jewish literary character who's a colonizer, a conqueror, someone who solves his problems not by reconciling with God and getting deeper into the Word of God, but someone who solves their problems by conquering Palestine. The only problem Uris did not manage to overcome is how to reconcile the facts with his fiction. So this guy's saying Uris's book is awesome. If only it wasn't filled with lies, but whatever, at least people believe it. He left that to others. This will not be easy, but it will not be achieved by critics who point to the literary and historical shortcomings of Exodus. However real these may be, it's admitting that it's filled with crap. For this is the image of Israel that is fixed now more firmly in the mind of generations of our day than that was projected by Herzl, Weizmann, and even Ben-Gurion. So, praising this book for how well it tricks people into supporting Israel, and admitting that the book isn't factual. And this is why Norman Finkelstein does an analysis of the book, and I'm pointing to my copy of Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine Conflict, which is over there. And all Finkelstein does is go through the claims made in Exodus, the history given in Exodus, and compares them to reality. And says, look, this book plays so loosely with the facts. It's not based in facts at all. Yet, so many British and Americans, and this author says more British and American people than even have read the Bible, have read this book and think it's true, even though it's nonsense. So Kanafani responds to this and says, a close examination of this quote leads one to an astonishing discovery. If this was written about any other novel, the novel would be regarded as a failure. The points that John Kimchi and others have made about Exodus as positives would by any measure of critique obliterate any other novel. In Kimchi's opinion, the value of Exodus lies in the fact that it has become more ubiquitous than the Bible and that it is now regarded as an official report on Israel's establishment. He claims that the novel did not reconcile the facts with fiction and that it put sex, success, and James Bondism into Zionism. This contradiction does not lead to any reservations. On the contrary, Kimchi calls those who insist on exposing the novel's historical and scientific shortcomings, like Finkelstein, to come to terms with them, all for the sake of maintaining Israel's illusory image in the mind of readers. This is a deception of a peculiar kind. While a prominent Israeli figure regards the book to be vulgar and derivative, he insists that it is great for Jewish Americans. So it's BS, but it's great for tricking Americans into supporting Israel. So it's awesome. What then is the purely artistic measure against which a Zionist work is judged? If everything is justified for the sake of serving a prior conclusion, what is the standard against which the quality of art may be critiqued? And why does Zionist art alone stand as an exception to the established standards of literary criticism? This tendency, above all, is what drives a critic like Mordecai Rickler to state that it has become increasingly attractive for the American Jew to become a novelist and to become controversial and distinctive as well. Committing technical and historical errors can suddenly count as merits, much like what has happened with countless Zionist literary works. All this is due to the contradiction that lies within Zionist ideology itself. I'm going to repeat that. All this is due to the contradiction that lies within Zionist ideology itself and its propagandistic requirement that art must perform directly in the political arena. The Zionist novel is not required, as is the case with other novels around the world, to thoroughly explore the facts. On the contrary, it is required to invent new facts at any cost and then protect them, often by appealing to the guilty conscience of the European critic and his illusory responsibility towards Israel. So weaponization of the Holocaust, saying you have to support our colonization of Palestine. You did the Holocaust towards us, Europeans. So you see, the more explicitly political these books become, the more they have to lie. Exodus is an explicitly political book. The heroes of that book are Zionist conquerors who found the state of Israel and Palestine. And in order to justify that, it needs to use countless lies and distortions of history. And Israeli officials recognize this. They recognize that it's not a good history book, but they love it because Americans and British people are reading it. And when they read it, they're more likely to support the state of Israel and the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. So almost done here. Oh, actually, I think that's all I had for that book. So yeah, On Zionist Literature by Ghassan Kanafani. I went through it today, but it's really something that people should read. It's so incredibly valuable to read a Marxist analysis of Zionism from somebody deeply involved in the struggle and somebody who saw it firsthand, somebody who was expelled from his home by Zionists and who was killed in a car bomb by Zionists for his excellent work. It's such a valuable piece of work for Marxists and anti-imperialists and socialists like us to read from someone from our own tradition who was there, who was in the struggle, who was in the shit, right? How valuable, what perspective could be more valuable for us Marxists in America being indoctrinated with Zionist propaganda like the book/movie Exodus? Right? What could be more valuable than hearing one of our comrades involved in that specific struggle, debunk and dissect and analyze the historical roots of the propaganda that the ruling class is using in that same struggle? Right? So I really recommend people get on Zionist literature and Kanafani's other books. Unfortunately, he stopped writing at the age of 31 because the Israeli Mossad killed him and his niece in a car bomb. But we can only imagine how many other amazing works of art and works of literature he would have produced had the fascist state of Israel not killed him for being a luminary. And this is what Israel does. They systematically kill the intellectual and cultural leaders in Palestine. And then they say, oh, the Palestinians have never produced anything. The Palestinians have never created anything. They're so backwards compared to the Israelis. Like, no, they've produced a whole bunch of stuff. And anytime they do, you kill the people producing it. You're the ones who are backwards. You are the ones who are holding humanity back. You're anti-humanity. You're in favor of killing people who have put out some of humanity's greatest works of academia and greatest works of art. Israel can suck